Welcome back, students. We have been talking about how natural selection can cause the characteristics of a species to change over time. In our discussions, we've emphasized that natural selection depends on variations within a population of organisms. But how does a population of organisms become varied in the first place? Variations are the result of mutations, which are permanent changes in the DNA sequence of a gene. So, for example, let's say that we have a population of moths, and these moths carry a gene for making brown pigment. So, let's look over here. These moths have their what's it called? They make brown color pigment. So these moths. Okay, so the normal DNA sequence, that is the recipe or instructions for making pigment in the moths, may read something like the following: AT, CC, GG, ATA. Now you recognize those letters as the nitrogen bases that we learned earlier in the year when we were learning about DNA. Okay, so that's the recipe for making brown pigment protein. However, let's say that at some point, some individual moth gets a random mutation, or in other words, the instructions or recipe has a mistake. So, if this were to happen in the pigment protein gene, let's say that the new sequence accidentally has an A where there should be a G. Now, because the instructions are wrong, the normal brown pigment is no longer made, and thus the moth will have albino coloring. We can see that over here. This moth has the mutation, therefore does not make the pigment protein correctly, and so the color of the moth is white, which is a variation compared to the rest of the population. Okay, so now let's compare two different ways that this mutation could affect the population. In this first situation, the mutation would have a harmful effect on the moth. It has a harmful effect on the moth because it makes the moth stand out amongst the brown trees, and therefore it is likely to be quickly identified by a bird to be eaten. However, let's say these moths live in a different environment, one in which there are many birch trees with white bark. You can see that on the right here. This moth here, against the white bark, this pigment mutation is no longer a harmful variation, but in fact, it's exactly the opposite. In this new environment, the albino variation can help the moth camouflage into its environment, and therefore, this moth in this particular environment is now more likely to survive. There's my happy face. To survive and thrive and pass on its albino gene to the offspring, who will also be more likely to survive and pass on the gene until after many generations, this entire moth population has the albino adaptation. Okay, let's look at a couple other examples of adaptations. Please carefully observe the three pictures that you see at the bottom. Next to each picture, I want you to write down the variation that some ancestor member of the species must have acquired through mutation. And then I want you to also write down, next to each picture, why that variation was actually an adaptation that allowed that organism to survive and to pass down its variation to future generations. Now, please note, I will check tomorrow to see that you've thought about these examples and that you've written down some suggestions. Okay, so we just learned that mutations in DNA instructions or gene sequences are always the initial cause of variation. I want to talk a little bit about how mutations can work in populations that are geographically separated. So we had that concept earlier, I believe in lecture 2, we had the concept of geographic separation. So let's look at this picture down here on the left. In times when sea levels are high, this isthmus that connects the two continents here would actually be covered over. So that would mean that any population of fish that lived in this area could actually swim back and forth to either of these oceans. They were one connected area, and so therefore the fish population would have been a continuous population. Any variation that you would find in one member of this population, if it was advantageous, could be passed and change the entire population. However, if this original population of fish becomes geographically separated, like it is in this picture, these fish are separated by this landmass. What will happen is that any mutation that is found in one subset of the population will remain restricted to that one subset. So if you look at these two fish, you can tell that these two fish species are related species that likely had a recent common ancestor. However, because these fish have been geographically separated, the types of variation in color, shape, and size that we see in this Caribbean population have not been shared with this Pacific population. You can see that over time, since they have been separated, variations have collected in these subpopulations separately. So any new mutation in one fish will change the variation in only one subset of the original population. In this way, we end up getting two separate species from our one original species. Okay, the opposite phenomenon can also occur. For example, if organisms from one population are suddenly able to join a second population, then variation can be increased in the second population. This is because any new members joining a population will bring their alleles with them. They may be carrying some alleles that are useful in the new environment, and those variations can be spread through successive generations in the new population. So, we can see, for example, at the bottom right here, as new individual deer join this second population, so we can see here, this guy and this guy have been able to join this second population of deer. As they join, they take their variations with them and add them in to the second population. And if those variations are advantageous, it may result in a shift in the characteristics of the entire population. Of course, if some individuals of a population move out of an area, the opposite can happen. They can take their variations with them, and that will decrease the variation of the original population. Again, this is because when an organism leaves, it will take with it any advantageous alleles it has, and it will leave behind a smaller pool of variations in the population that is remaining behind. Okay, so we're done for tonight. Don't forget your Quizmodo, and I will see you tomorrow.